So before we start this, I want to talk a little bit about the supporters. Now, this will only take a couple of seconds, but I want to talk about the very generous support of people who've made this happen. So we mentioned Arest, his fantastic team. We've got tons of people in the room today. They've all contributed by buying tickets. We've got people online who are helping by watching the videos, buying virtual tickets, using Buy Me a Coffee, all this kind of stuff. So lots and lots of support to cover the cost of this event. It's Arest and myself who've put this all together. We don't have any big organizations behind us. And starting this morning, we were still a little bit short on the target of the cost of putting this on. And that's why I want to mention two fantastic organizations who've jumped in at the last minute and sort of helped get this over the line financially. We've got UkrainianFreedomNews.com. We'll put a link to that. We'll put a link to that in the video. And with extremely generous support from Tom in Georgia, US. Big up to Tom. He's very kindly donated a phenomenal sum there to help that out. He's an American Special Forces veteran who is also a chef. He came to Lviv several years ago, and in between his work around the world, this full-scale invasion has sort of activated his sense of civic duty, and he's massively helped us out today. Also, one of our speakers next, Taras, has very generously put out a huge promotion on his online network, his news network. We'll put links to that as well. Tvoe Misto, we're going to talk about his work on that channel, but incredibly generous at helping to publicize the event today. But I want to say a huge thank you to those two sponsors and a massive thank you to everyone attending here in person. All our speakers have come here at their own expense. That's incredibly generous. Brooks and his son have flown in from the UK especially to be here. So I want to thank everybody who has really sort of jumped in and helped make this happen. We all believe this is incredibly important to help Ukraine's victory. Well, I'll stop waffling on. Let's get our next guests onto the stage. We've got fantastic journalist activists who are helping Ukraine to achieve victory. So I will introduce them one by one, get them onto the stage. First of all, let's get Alina Poliakova, managing editor of the Ukrainian version of Ukrainska Pravda, an extremely powerful communicator and journalist. Please come and join. Next, we have Yulia Tymoshenko, editor and chief of St. Javelin, passionate, effective, international advocate for Ukraine. And we have Taras Yatsenko, director of Tvoe Misto portal and a local media expert. Thank you so much. And lastly, you'll know the orange hat from a mile away. This is John Sweeney. I'm delighted to welcome him here. Investigative journalist and writer, author, and orange hat advocate extraordinaire. Please come onto the stage. Brilliant, let's take our seats and let's kick it off. So we've had short introductions there. This panel is really all about the challenges of reporting on the war. This is especially challenging in an environment of intense Russian disinformation. Western media has, through lack of local knowledge, lack of historic background, sometimes can create a very distorted view of what's happening here, the reality on the ground. Sometimes also, despite good intentions, reporting can be influenced by Russian propaganda narratives in historical, imperial mythologies and weaponized disinformation. And it really doesn't help that social media is divided and polarized like never before. I'm hoping our experts today, who are also activists for Ukrainian victory, can help us to unpick the complexities and issues of the media landscape and actually help inspire people to control the narrative and get involved in helping to get information out. So let's start with that question. Let's start with their individual stories, but also the challenges that each individual on the panel has had in getting the truth as they see it out. Let's go down the line, and please, let's start with that.
Okay. I can start. I'm working on Ukrainska Pravda. It's one of the biggest online media in Ukraine, which was launched in 2000, but our project, our English version, was launched in the morning of the 24th of February last year. We had a safe protocol which said that if you cannot leave the city on your own, then you should go to the office and they will evacuate everyone in the safe place. But people didn't want to be evacuated and they want to do something which will help us to spread information not only on the Ukrainian audience but to the foreigners, to the West. And that's why in several hours we have launched English version of Ukrainska Pravda. At the beginning it was fully volunteering project. European Commission has helped to find us native speakers who were our editors, and they are our editors still, and the people who left the country but they still were eager to help, they were our translators, and they still are our translators. And only in 5 months, I think, we have found a fundraiser and we could pay money for their help. And as for now, we have 22 people who are our employees on the English version, and still some people who do not want to be paid. They are just volunteers and they just want to help. So, and if you ask the main challenge, I think that our main challenge was to build the structure. How should it be understandable for foreigners? So it should be different language, because in Ukrainian version you can find that we can call Russians orcs and etc. etc. But for foreign audience it should be Russian forces, it should be Russians. So they but still we need to remember that it's Russians, it's not some mythical creatures.
Just don't pronounce the language of Mordor here. That's what I've learned as well. John, over to you.
So the first question that might strike people is, why on earth is this nutter wearing an orange woolly hat with it being very hot outside? It's quite simple. I started wearing this because I was I turned up in Kyiv February 22, and I thought Putin was up to no good, I'm staying. And it was cold, it was freezing, and I just bought this in an Italian ski hat shop. I said, haven't you got a proper colour? No, but for you, €3. So anyway, and the thing is, very early on, I have to say, because one should always tell the truth about things, I'm in Ukraine. The Ukrainian cops and Ukrainian soldiers were a bit paranoid. And I kept on being arrested for being a Russian spy. And I wore this hat as a simple symbol, as well as it being cold, to show to Ukrainian cops, Ukrainian soldiers, I wasn't military. And I wasn't an orc. An orc's a Russian. Sorry, that's a joke. So it became a thing. But day 2, I was arrested for being a Russian spy by this crazy Ukrainian soldier. And I said, do I look like a Russian spy? And he put up his gun and pointed it at me. Give me your passport. I said, you're not a policeman. And he almost killed me. And by the way, the reason I'm stumbling is that man is Vlad Tymoshenko, and we've become great friends. And last night, he's spending most of his time, he's now in Special Forces, somewhere near the Bakhmut area. He's got a break, and last night we went drinking. And I'm still recovering. But anyway, to cut to the chase, it's right and proper, and it's absolutely important, and I think too few people in the West understand this. This is not just Ukraine's war, it's our war too. Russia has been at war with the West for a long time under Putin. And how are we, the West, doing in this war we don't know we're fighting? And the answer is we're doing badly. I believe that first Brexit and then Trump were paid for in part by dark Russian money, and that we are, even as we speak, on the wrong end of a massive influence operation by the Kremlin to make us mad, to destroy our democracies and to make us fight with each other in a way which is dark and terrible. And what we've got to do is tell the truth about the war, tell what's happening. And there's the greater difficulty I've got these days is dealing with apathy and dealing with boredom in the West. It's a real problem. This war is continuing. People are continuing to die. And at the same time to say, listen, it's not just Ukraine's war. Because if Russia wins in Ukraine, then we're next.
Julia.
So I'm accidentally matching with John. Didn't plan to, but very accidentally, I realized that we're, I mean, there's a lot of jokes we could make about orange color in 2004 in Ukraine, which I'm not going to do, but talking about jokes. So
So you get your fashion tips from me?
Yes.
What's wrong with you?
You're inspiring me every day, you know. I look at your outfit and I'm like, I need something like
You need more,
like that.
more orange in your life.
Yeah. So speaking about jokes and humor, so I spend most of my time and dedicate most of my time working for Javelin, which a lot of you I think know. It's a very, I guess, non-trivial organization that both like covers the war in a very unique social media, fun way, which is like sounds like an oxymoron, but actually it's something that we've learned that helps people from abroad, even Ukrainians themselves, not to dissociate from all the horrors, but kind of like keep their morale and mood through memes, through unusual kind of like content that makes fun of Russians, the orcs and stuff, where we're allowed kind of like to say a little bit more and make like more general kind of statements from Ukrainian perspective, but specifically for the international community of Ukrainian supporters, and it's incredible because we've got like an amazing community, and we can see how much their support and the unity has been really crucial on the media and informational landscape for Ukraine, because something that we advocate for and something that we explain, we can see that those people are carrying those messages in their own communities around the world. But I think this approach of like, especially translating sometimes dark Ukrainian humor, which I'm sure a lot of people who spend time in Ukraine starting to understand, is also very, very important, because it's a great coping mechanism. Even for myself, I remember during, the scariest days when I was fearing for my own life, the life of my family who survived the Russian occupation in Kyiv region, I would make the most ridiculous, darkest jokes, and my friends who are non-Ukrainian, they were like, Julia, oh my gosh, like, how can you say this? And I'm like, because like, I'm so tired of crying. I'm so tired of feeling like I can't say that, like crap, and I just, sometimes I want to say those things just because it makes me feel better a little bit. It also makes, Russians look ridiculous when you make the funniest memes about it, like Moskva ship being promoted to submarine or stuff like that. There's a lot of golden things. Something that I take really big pride on, which I'm pretty sure you've heard the song Courage, Bridge and Fire. So we created, together with my Javelin colleague, we created that. We didn't know how to make it seem like they are actually singing Courage, Bridge and Fire. He actually tried to edit the video, and it was on the day when the Courage Bridge was struck the first time. And I just said, just like put subtitles, because the subtitles will trick your brain to hear as you read it. And since then, I don't know, like I consider it the most successful accidental psyop that I did through Javelin, because there was Hungarian media this like a couple last weeks actually saying how like cruel Ukrainians are celebrating. So they thought that was true, they were actually saying, and then there was like Russian media trying to disprove it. So it's hilarious. And then like articles, I think because it's a football team, football fans chanting that. I think they're like some of the UK sports publication actually published a video. What's the relation between like the football fans and the Courage, Bridge and Fire song, which is incredible. Yeah. So so this is the things we do at St. Javelin specifically. I think it's a very unusual, obviously, non-traditional way of pushing out information with a very specific goal of like raising support and making fun of Russians and raising morale around the world. But I think it also plays like a very crucial role. Obviously, it's not, you know, my colleagues are doing very serious investigative journalism here, which is even more important, but I think it also has a place in Ukrainian social media / informational warfare and covering the very dark things that Russia is doing too.
I think you've thrown down the gauntlet there. I think drinks afterwards, the challenge is to come up with another song.
Yes.
I think something like London Bridge is falling down, but the words are the Kremlin walls are falling down, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we accept the challenge. People should try it, you know.
Submit your verses and ideas. Taras.
Thank you. Our experience was probably, I don't know, maybe in some degree a little more boring because we are local media serving community needs of this, how Oris said today, 1 million people village. Or I call it just the best city in the world, Lviv. And on the first day of invasion, since 5 a.m., we were just making all the news like every few minutes, all our team. But when we got together, we felt that everyone was so nervous. Our cameramen were having hands just shaking like that, and all the others, journalists. And realized that when we make more news of these short news, what's happening, we have more and more panic, and we decide that information may be also some kind of healing process if we manage it right. And we brought together different people from like local government, from military side, from some economists, because there were huge lines to banks. And to ATMs, philosopher, scientists, priests, chaplain, and we just had maybe 4 or 5 hours conversation, and it went viral, and I think it made all of us much more calmer and just do our work. And of course, there were many other challenges, like how do you survive with your media, how do you manage it when all the advertising stopped immediately, when there are so many other challenges, and work is 10 times more than before. But I think that the main challenge for us was even not that, not running the media, but trying to tell the truth outside to the world. Because we felt from the very first days, and even before invasion, that there were so few people I mean, even if we start talking about international journalists, who'd really understand the context. Some award-winning journalists, few times Pulitzer Prize winners, were coming to us because they all based in Lviv in the first 2 months, and they were asking questions like, okay, we know that this is about Ukrainian nationalism. We have to find these nationalists who are hiding somewhere in the forests, or, yeah, exactly, or with javelins, or we need to find, or let's talk about peace, and there were so many really stupid questions that we realized, okay, we need to explain them something. And a few days before invasion, we didn't know when invasion would happen, we, with our good friend Joe Lindsay, who will be here in one of the next panels, came up together with the idea to make a printed, because we're a digital media, but we came up with the idea to make a printed paper saying bold things, explaining the context, and we agreed with all major restaurants, hotels, where all these diplomats and journalists stayed, that they will read it. And it said, we will resist 5 reasons why Ukrainians will win. We designed it on February 22nd and went to printer the night before invasion, the next day.
That's brilliant.
So it was a little bit too late.
And this gets us on to, I think, a very powerful subject. We're going to tackle this later on as well. And that is, despite often their crudeness, despite their absolutely palpable nonsense that the Kremlin spews out, some of these narratives cut through. And you see hints of them in Western media quite unconsciously. Some of this stuff cuts through. Like, Crimea is Russian. If you speak Russian, you must be Russian and want to be part of Russia. There's all this nonsense does make it through. And I still speak to people who are influenced by these narratives that they heard 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 12 months ago, and it prevents them hearing the reality of the situation. So I'd like to go through the panel and, first of all, tell me your #1 Russian bullshit story and how you've been fighting this nonsense over the last, well, I mean, for some people have been doing it a lot longer than a year and a half. You know, it's been going on for 2 decades. But I'd like to hear what you think is the most pernicious Russian lie and how you go about tackling it. Let's go down the line, starting, or whoever wants to go first, yeah.
As usual. I think that I have no one example of that, but we still see that after a year and a half, Western media still use Russian transliteration, and it's Kiev, not Kiev, it's Odessa with double S, and all this stuff, which should be, it shouldn't be on the media if you are worldwide media which spread true information. And we have seen that from the beginning, in first 3 months of the full-scale invasion, that all these BBC standards, it's just a myth, because they have these standards, but they still propose the second point of view to Russians, so they can spread their propaganda narratives more and more. And for me, it's the most insane thing that Western media are doing.
I agree with that. I got one of my own there, which is na Ukraini или v, and that you can tell them apart there. John.
Ukraine is Nazi. There's a moment, which is the great big Russian lie. There's a moment early on, late February, early March last year. I'm freelance and I have no money, no backers, no first aid kit, no helmet, no flak jacket. But I have a determination that so long as I've got enough alcohol and my courage. Now, if either my alcohol or my supply of courage ran out, I was leaving. But unless those two things happened, then I was staying. And I became afraid because I was running out of alcohol and it was impossible to get hold of a drink. And then I found the Buena Vista, which was illegally open. And the story goes, the senior policeman came in and said, "Hey, Max, it's great you're open." Anyway, in the middle of all of this, I found my 7 bottles of Italian red. Everything was good. But the hardest thing was, but all the Ukrainians are Nazis. And then there's this sweet moment where I get a call from the Jewish Chronicle in London, and they say, we'd like you to string for us from Kyiv. We'd like you to write stories about the war. And I said, I'm not Jewish. I eat bacon sandwiches. And the guy said, we know. And then there's a long pause, and he said, there's no one else. And it struck me that it would be good for somebody like me, who's actually, I've met and challenged Vladimir Putin, because over the shooting down of MH17, I first called Vladimir Putin a war criminal 23 years ago when I saw with my own eyes evidence of the Russian army's war crimes in Chechnya. That it would be fun for me, with this history, to work for the Jewish Chronicle in a Nazi state, Ukraine. And I have arguments with people on Twitter where I say, well, the president is Jewish, and I think the previous, although I still string the Jewish Chronicle, I'm not fantastically up on Jewish stuff, but I think the previous president, Tymoshenko, was also Jewish. I don't really care, but this isn't a Nazi state, full stop. Russia, fuck off. Stop lying. Stop lying about this. And then there's a kind of, it's very simple, isn't it? Nazi is as Nazi does. Russia invades countries, Ukraine doesn't. Russia has invaded Georgia and effectively Syria and Chechnya, which my Chechen friends would argue ought to be a separate state, and one day will be, I hope and pray. Very, very simply, the Ukrainian army respects the rules of war. It does not rape, it does not castrate, it does not kill children. Now, any war machine, there is bound to be terrible things that happen and things go wrong. But the rules of war are clear, and Ukraine and the Ukrainian army respects them. The Russian army does rape, it does castrate Ukrainian POWs, it does torture people again and again and again. And that, to me, is Nazi. So the biggest simple single lie that the Russian state tells is Ukraine is Nazi. No, Ukraine is not Nazi. Take it from the man from the Jewish Chronicle. The state that's Nazi, effectively, is Russia. Vladimir Putin and the Russians that support him do fuck off.
Demonetized right there.
Well, there is, first of all, I agree with all of those.
Where's my colors?
Yeah, and I'm we're in the same, we can start a party in Ukraine, you know? With my last name, it's going to be really great. Yes, so I think there's a lot, to start with, like, Russian culture is great, and then we never talk about the appropriation and how it became great on the expense of all of other countries and nations that Russia has occupied throughout the centuries, or that the war, or, like the Russian aggression towards Ukraine only started in 2014, and then, I think the one that is very personal to me as well, it became personal after February and March 2022, is that territorial concessions to Russia will make peace with Russia somehow. I don't know how Russia has been able to convince so many people that it's better to freeze the conflict, because look how many conflicts were frozen with Russia. How many times Russia has been appeased in these last 20 years for all the horrible things we did. We were very wrong word. We were remembering the invasion of Georgia a few days ago, and the pictures from the first day of civilians injured, dying from the Russian attacks were so striking, but at the same time, the same day, I think Russia bombed Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region, and it's literally like the same picture. And it's been how many years apart? More than a decade apart, and Russia is still doing the same thing. What happened in Georgia? There were territorial concessions, a frozen conflict where, did it help? No. It's literally they're doing the same, even on more massive scale in Ukraine right now. And I think the reason why it's also personal now, and now I say sometimes to people that now I think if somebody, especially a person from another country tells me no, you should guys just give up territory and to save lives. And it's always this, the narrative you need to give up territories to save lives, which is the most absurd thing I've ever heard in my life. And first of all, I think it's very disrespectful to all Ukrainian heroes who have been dying and giving up their lives for the freedom of this country and for all of our lives here, because this is exactly what they don't want. They wanted to fight and they wanted to protect freedom. But second of all, it's also very it's completely absurd because it's actually supporting the genocide, because it's something that when people say that, it means that they either don't care or they like very deliberately choose to ignore what's happening on the occupied territories right now, not only in Ukraine but in other parts, you know, and how Russia deliberately like does genocide, destroys the nation, you know, deports the kids, all of these horrible crimes, torture. There's so many of these accounts already from all recently liberated Ukrainian territories, and I think to say that you need to give up territory is absurd. But for me personally, it became something very close to me and kind of like taken home when my dad and my grandparents had to survive the Russian occupation in March of 2022 in Kiev region, in the eastern part on the way of Chernihiv. That's when the Russians from the east were approaching Kiev, and they actually took a route that, as my grandparents were actually saying, like going through villages that even the German Nazis didn't take, because they did like a very weird way, because they obviously couldn't move on the highway because they would be just like bombed by Ukrainians. But looking back, it was like one of the most horrific moments in my life when I was like just messaging my dad, hoping that I would get the message back that he's alive. I was so scared that they would start going into the houses. I was lucky because like our village they weren't actually just like hanging out there, because when they couldn't take Kiev, they just like spent a couple of weeks just sitting in the villages. In the villages nearby, there were mass rapes, there were torture, there were people kidnapped. Some of the people they're still disappeared, and most likely the Russians took them. And to know that somebody can, especially from the safety of their own home somewhere in the West, tell me like, no, you should just give up territories. I'm like, I really, like sometimes I respond to people, I really want to slap you right now, and I think I have a right to do that. Because if that was your home, if that was your dad, your grandparents, your childhood home, your memories right now being under Russian control and under the danger of being killed, kidnapped, you know, tortured, raped, all of that, I think you wouldn't even dare to say this. But just because for you it's just an imaginary place on the map, you think that it's something that you're like even can dare to say. So that's absurd. But a lot of people still push this narrative, and it makes my blood boil.
Taras.
Oh, I had much longer time than the others to think, so I'm reminded of so many different lies from Russia that I can't pick the biggest one.
I've got a top 10 list here, so I'm checking them off.
Okay, good. I think, so there are a few, I don't know, just maybe a few of them. One of the most recent one that Putin, I think, said just a few days ago that no, we don't want to occupy all Ukraine. We just want 4 regions that are in our constitution. Bullshit. At first, their goal was to occupy all Ukraine. When they realized it's not possible, then they want to destroy, and that's not about Putin only. It's the Russian people altogether. They want to destroy Ukrainian nation. Ukrainian people, absolutely. It's not about just different reasons. Second, they say, oh, they are banning Russian church in Ukraine, but we have so many facts and proofs that it's not a church, it's a KGB network. Then they will say that Ukraine is a failed state. Okay, we can now read a book for great expert, American expert of British, Polish origin, Janusz Brzezinski, about failed state of Russia and its inevitable disruptor in the nearest future. And they could also say, I think one of the biggest lie, which I think the West still believes in, is that Putin will use nukes. That's what I think was and it still is a very strong motivation for many people in the West, from my perspective, not to act, not to be more proactive, but they don't know the psychology of a person we call gopnik in Ukraine. So it was a special person in the 90s, hooligans, who neglect any rules, but they know only one rule: when they get punched in the nose, they will get back. And that's why they want to scare you, and they just scare. And we had in our studio, when we realized that so many journalists from all over the world don't understand the context, we started bringing all people from major publications to our studio in Lviv and bringing different intellectuals for an hour of the record conversation about the context of Ukraine and Russia, etc. And I remember our prominent psychotherapist, Roman Kechur from Lviv. He was learning psych of Putin and Russian nation for many years, and he said that as a clinicist, so he never met Putin, but from what he sees, that is a person that is extremely afraid of dying because of this huge table, white table, all the laboratories going on. So because of so many reasons, bunker, that means that if he pushes the red button, he understands that he will die later, sooner or later, probably sooner. And that means that will make him not do this. So almost 2 years that are from that time, and so many people in the West are still believing in this lie.
I didn't have that, but I had the nuclear terrorism on my list. I didn't have the failed state one because it's so patently absurd. Anyone who has actually been outside of Moscow and gone to rural Russia and villages will know that that's the very definition of a failed state. If you've lived in a house that has not connected to the gas supply, not connected to the water supply, done a shit over a bucket in Russia's provinces, and then you realize that there are millions and millions of Russians who live like this in the largest gas-producing country in the world. That is the very definition of a kleptocracy and a failed state. So I'm glad you brought that one up. I'm going to go through my list. I hope that could be useful, and then we'll jump back into the questions. I got Ukrainian Nazis here, number one, so thanks, John, for that one. I'd extend it, though. Russians make a big play of liberating Europe from Nazis, forgetting that they replaced one tyranny with another. They carried out a mass rape in Berlin of tens, hundreds of thousands of women. They then terrorized Eastern Europe for 50 years. So, interesting definition of liberation. We've got Ukrainians and Russians are one people. That's, yeah, I know, that's going to get a lot of size there. That's absolute nonsense that needs to be overcome. Crimea is Russian, anyone who speaks Russian is Russian. We know that's not true. There'll be a corner of Oxford that they'll be laid claim to if that was true. I speak the language of Mordor, I'm afraid. The Holodomor was just a bad harvest. We've got a special video with a Holodomor expert on the channel. That is one of the most evil lies that comes out of Russia. That Ukraine is divided, that the East is naturally Russian and they're different from the West, that Poland is going to invade and take over Western Ukraine. That's one that's really being pushed at the moment. Absolute pure Kremlin nonsense. That Ukraine is culturally poor, that actually there is no Ukraine, that the Ukrainian language is a fiction. It doesn't really have literature. It's more of a sort of peasant culture. It's kind of amusing, but it's not in the first tier of world cultures. We all know that one. Russia is strong, huge. Russia is inevitable and eternal. Well, we can end on that one, because Russia's going to fail and Russia's going to fall apart, and that's maybe one of the biggest lies of all. Anyway, I'm the moderator. I'm supposed to be the impartial one, so I'll step back into that role, and that leads into the next question, which is the question of so-called impartiality and objectivity, because it seems to me that the Western media has failed in a number of senses in actually reporting the truth of this war. Not necessarily through the acts of individual journalists, because there are fantastic journalists out there, many that John will know and have worked with, especially in places like sort of Channel 4, Sky News and others. There are brilliant journalists out there on the ground. But collectively, it seems to me that the Western media and its formats are failing to report this war and its importance. So I'll put that question over to you, why the Western media is failing, why war fatigue is taking over, and what can be done about it, and why Western media is letting us down in the digital age. Who wants to tackle that first? Tara, let's go to Taras maybe. Or digital media, let's start with Tara. Oh, well, okay.
Okay, as usual. So I think that the main problem was at the beginning when they start to call it a conflict, and they didn't get in and didn't know that in 2014 it was also a war, and they called it like a civil war, which is nonsense. And I think that the main problem is that the big Western media have opened their bureaus in Ukraine after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, but the heads of this bureau, also always Russians, they were working in Moscow because Ukraine is in this region, and they covered it from the Russian perspective always, and that's why they are not objective on their covering even now when they are in Ukraine. Of course, like, there is some time and they're learning something, but still they can make so bad mistakes that cannot be like forgiven, as for me. And I can add for the thesis that people can be more proactive, but they are scared that Russia is very big and it's very powerful. What I see now when I open our analytics, and I see that people from like United States, from Great Britain, from different parts of the world, the most popular news among them starts like Putin says, like Russia will something, and they still like think that Russia is very powerful, and they want to know what Putin says and what Russia is doing. They are not interested in Ukraine as they should be.
I'll come back to that question. I think that's a very important one, but we'll go through this and then we'll come back to that Russia first lens. John?
I'm a deconstructionalist. We keep on doing it this way, so I think we should do it the other way.
As you say. I think there are different reasons probably, but the main reason from my perspective is lack of understanding the context. That's what I mentioned already. That's what we were struggling with from the very early days after invasion and even before. And it's inevitable because, you know, Ukraine's history is like, it takes centuries. It takes much longer period than the history of the United States. And of course, people in the US or elsewhere in the world couldn't and shouldn't know everything about Ukraine, especially knowing that probably Ukraine was not too proactive about Ukraine before the invasion, before the full-scale invasion. Then I think that it takes also, I remember, because I have so many bad examples, I would say a few of good examples of journalists. My friend, all of them are now my friends. First, Mari Saito from Reuters. She came from Japan in the early days after invasion. While coming here, she bought 4 books on Amazon of history of Ukraine in English. She read 3.5 of them. And then she came to our sessions and to bring all the blind dots together. And she made great stories, fantastic investigations, perfect investigations. And also she made a fantastic story about why Ukraine and Russia are absolutely different nations. That's one example. Second example is my friend Tim Mack, from former NPR journalist, who came here, and from the early weeks or months after invasion, he was telling me every time we met over beer, like, oh, Taras, don't you think it's such a high price for this small piece of territory? Don't you think it's better to negotiate about peace, blah, blah, blah? And after maybe, I don't know, 8 or 9 or more months, after traveling all over Ukraine, he understood everything, but it took time for him to understand the context and why this is not a game of Ukraine and Russia, why this is the game of the world, and we have to win here, and we will win. And afterwards, he resigned NPR and started his own newsletter, which he called Counteroffensive. So now he believes in Ukraine very strongly. And my third great example is my friend Joe Lindsay, who came to Ukraine and stayed here for a few years already. So he's stuck in pandemic, but he had in compared to many, many, many other journalists who just came here from, I don't know, Latin America, Africa, anywhere they were sent to from DC or London, but they lived here and understood Ukraine. And as you were speaking today with Oris at the very beginning, you have to be on the ground and you have to understand people in order to really understand the truth. And if you understand the truth, then you can tell it to the world.
Yeah, I just want to really support that point, because I think, yeah, the Moscow lens and being a chief of bureau in Moscow and then being transferred to Ukraine, like, it really shows in the reporting. I think sometimes I speak to a lot of people who are, you know, a part of either, like, you know, Western journalism school, canon, whatever, and sometimes they're like, well, there was another way, you know, that's how media works. If you wanted to cover Eastern Europe, some of them are even like of Ukrainian origin. They're either like American, Canadian, but they're of Ukrainian origin. So obviously they have way more knowledge and just, you know, understanding of the region. But they were like, yeah, well, if you wanted to get into this region, covering this place, you had to go through Moscow bureau and be there, and then it's a difficult conversation because, like, yeah, if that's how the system works, like, how do you change it? What do you do? Obviously, there were a lot of brilliant journalists that came to Ukraine still, despite, and like either, you know, independently or really advocated for that kind of coverage within their media rooms and spaces. But something that I wanted to say specifically that bothers me a lot. And it's ridiculous to me that it's still happening. It's been already the second year, more than a year and a half of the full-scale invasion, but there's still this like both-sideism coverage in the media. The most like recent one that was so widespread and so painful, and even some of my Ukrainian media colleagues, they were so frustrated, and some of them were telling me that we're losing this media war, so-called, because specifically of that day of how the English-speaking Western media covered the Kakhovka explosion, because they were like, well, we can't send a journalist there to cover. I mean, there's no like concrete proof who did it. So obviously Russia says that Ukraine did it because, I mean, Russia said that Ukraine is going to invade Russia. That's why they invaded, right? You know, like by that logic, we can make so many ridiculous arguments and claims. So they're like, yeah, Ukraine also says that Russia did it. So what are we going to do? Instead of being responsible reporters by giving that context that Taras is saying is super important, but actually analyzing who does it benefit to by seeing, like, you know, how Russia operates in these kinds of wars, because it's not the first time they do this kind of like infrastructure terrorism. And instead of doing all of that, because you can still kind of like say, well, Russia claims this, but Russia has like a history of just pure lying and like putting the stuff, you know, how kind of like you say, like, to believe that Russia is going to do something, you need to say you need to see what they're saying about others and what they're saying that others are going to do, because that's how they work. It's just like a pure lie, and like, you know, saying Ukraine is Nazi is actually a reflection on them. So and that's their tactic in any kind of, you know, crisis communication or situation like that. So to me, seeing a bunch of reports, there were some quite good ones. I remember, I think it was Time that still kind of like Ukraine and Russia say both, but they provided that context, both in their like large article and even on social media accounts, because obviously social media provides even less space to give this context, but they didn't neglect it. They still put it there. But there were, I think, still the overwhelming majority was doing this, both sides are saying. And to me, I don't understand how you as a responsible journalist, how you can quote Putin or any kind of Russian official and take him seriously, like Lavrov or, you know, that guy Nebezhnya who's in the UN. Well, there is also like a history from even last week or like the day before of ridiculous claims that are so, like, just pure lies. They're just so easy to disprove. But then the next year, like, oh, but this day he said something, and because we cannot go or send our journalists there or like prove it, so-called, we're just gonna quote him as if it's, you know, if it's something that is substantial, and that is incredibly frustrating. I think one of my friends, Mariam Nayem, she wrote an op-ed in Politico saying how just, you know, alone and devastated that she felt, but she was kind of like resonating every Ukrainian's feelings in that day, because I think it really, really took a hit on our morale. Not the dam explosion specifically, the Russian attack on the dam, because obviously that was incredibly hard to watch. But that on top, like seeing people who are supposed to be not even our like allies, but are supposed to be responsible, good journalists doing this kind of harmful practice was really, really devastating. So yeah, if any of the media watches us, please don't do this. Just it's embarrassing, to be honest, and just quite sad that it's still a practice. Yeah.
Now, John, you know how the big media machine works. You had to leave that big media machine in order to create your version of reality.
I like my version of reality. I'm going to use my words carefully. Some Western media, some Western journalists have been bloody good, full stop. But too many have committed a category mistake. And the category mistake is to see, and the phrase we use, certainly when I was at the BBC, is something like the Westminster model. The Conservative Party say this, the Labour Party say that. And that is fine and good if the context is an ancient democracy where the rules of the conversation are clear to all. Russia is not in that category, full stop. It, I think, has been a fascist state for a long time, and for quite a lot of that time when I was reporting on it, I wasn't allowed to call it what it was, a fascist state. The big war, it makes it absolutely plain. It's easier to look at it now. So the category mistake, at least some of the Western media are guilty of, is seeing the world through the prism of what you would expect to see in Washington and Westminster. And the problem, of course, is, you know, have you heard of Donald Trump? Have you heard of some of the things Boris Johnson, and I know this is difficult for Ukrainians, but he threw parties and he banned us from going to funerals. It's difficult to get away with that. But let's go with Trump. Trump's easier to hit over the head. This is a man who is lying through his teeth. He lost an election and he claims he's won it. And then he created a massive civil disturbance, and people apply in the West. American newspapers talk about Trump saying this, but he's been debunked. And they don't apply that insurance policy when they talk about Putin. By the way, on the dam, I'm going to quick bit of advertising here. In my book, Killer in the Kremlin, which is not broadly supportive of Vladimir Putin, as you can work it out from the title, I actually said they're not going to use the Russians are not going to use tactical nukes because the Chinese have said don't do that. And the Kremlin is afraid of offending China. But, and I wrote the book, the paperback edition, in October last year, and it was published in February this year. But I fear that they will blow up the Novokhovka Dam. If you want the lottery numbers, come and see me afterwards. I don't
want this kind of lottery.
No, I hate. I was talking about another lottery in English. It's a joke. It's a shutка не смешная, c'est жар не смешный. Okay, I'm getting. Thank you for the correction. So the issue here is simple. It's like reporting this war is like being Ed Murrow, and I'm not Ed Murrow, but like being Ed Murrow in London in 1940. You cannot report on Nazi Germany because if you tell the truth, they will kill you. So the reason why it's difficult to say what's happening in Russia is because if you tell the truth and you're a good journalist, you get shot or you get poisoned. I knew Anna Politkovskaya. I knew Natasha Estemirova. Poisoned, then shot. Okay? You understand what I'm talking about? I'm talking to people out there. I'm talking to an American guy I met in the Groucho Club in January. He had some woman with him he'd bought from the internet. And he started saying America's wasting its money in Ukraine. And there's a certain point at which I started to lose my temper, and And I actually said to him, and I said it in such a voice that there was a pianist, and he stopped playing, and people started to move for the doors, like it's like a moment in a Wild West movie. And I said, listen, I am 65 years old, and it's embarrassing at my age to go around hitting people. So tonight you're lucky, but fuck off. And then I left. Anyway, I do feel strongly about this, but Western journalists need to understand this is like writing about Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. It's like reporting on them. And the idea you say, Mr. Hitler says this, you're going to look stupid when this is over. Stop it. Get on it. Understand that what comes from the Kremlin is a poison source, and tell your readers that.
And I'd add to that, follow the money. Whenever you smell a Russian narrative in someone's reporting, and they have, let's say, a strong academic background or whatever, but something smells wrong in what they're saying, follow the money, because it almost always will trace back to some kind of grant, some award, some association with an oligarch or dark money funding. And that's what you have to ask is, who is behind this point of view? Now, we know John is a citizen journalist, absolute probity about where the money comes from for the wine and everything else. But when you read a source, you've got to read what it's about. We've only got time for one more question, I think, on this panel. And I think it's an important one. It's one of the reasons that I created the channel. And that's the fear that weaponized social media can be a force for good, and it can be a force for evil. And the question I want to ask here is that if you come to this debate with some points of principle, you're going to fight for those principles, and you're going to fight people who are attacking those principles. Russia comes to this fight with no principles at all, no morality. They're prepared to burn their language, their culture, their people, their resources on the lies they're spinning. My question to the audience is, how do you tackle an enemy who is pioneering the post-truth society that believes in nothing except power, control, and domination, is prepared to say anything to achieve its goals?
I can start very quickly. I think, yes, I mean, when they come to the game, when they don't follow the rules, they do, you know. Russia has been pouring just crazy money in their informational warfare for years, and a lot of countries ignored it, or, you know, there were reasons, there were dark money and stuff, and I think John can talk about that. You know, we all know about the US elections and how Russia has employed the social media specifically to interfere into that, to like sway public opinions. It's actually very interesting that they used memes a lot. They created fake accounts, bots and trolls that use meme as this like form of disinformation. And I think back then, when was it, like 2016, I think there was very little of like research and also serious understanding of how fundamentally dangerous social media can be. And it's sort of was like after the US and like Brexit and the US elections, that was like the first aha moment, like, oh, something that we thought is like so great, social media specifically for like connecting the world, right now became is the biggest tool of dictators and just like horrible people who want to wreak havoc around the world. So I think with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Ukrainians being a very creative nation, I think like our tech and creative sectors are like one of the two of the most successful and most like incredible sectors in the country, like incredibly talented people here, and that really helped us because people, you know, who couldn't like go to the front lines, they started using either their creativity, their like tech skills or other things to like help to fight Russia in some way. But specifically also like the social media movement, and St. Javelin has been a part of it, but also like I want to say hi to NAFO and an amazing community. I know they're representatives here. They started using, I mean, basically the same Russian tactics that like don't follow any rules. The most like the funniest memes, like a little bullying of Russian propagandists and just like, you know, pro-Russian useful idiots on social media without any rules and like line. And some people might find it like a little bit like radical, so-called, but this is the thing, you cannot fight the enemy following the rules that they don't follow. Like, and that's specifically when it comes on like social media landscape. And I think that's why this like meme warfare, I think, has been incredible, because it's sort of like it uses the tactics that they've used in the past as well. But it's very effective because it can transcend the message very quickly. It sort of plays into the pop culture, other subcultures, and if you like tap into the right audience and they understand it, it can really boost the support towards Ukraine. And I think Russia specifically is very much like losing that, because can you name a good Russian meme about this invasion? I don't think so, but you can name probably like hundreds of really good cases. And Ukrainians are incredible. We've been doing it for a while. Like I think there is like news accounts that they post like a picture, like they report on like a real news, and you know, no like sarcasm or anything, but they use a meme instead of like a normal picture or image that corresponds to that news, and it's always like so funny, and it's like super popular in Ukraine. So Ukrainians have been using that humor to also as like a news tool, and I think that's why, at least on social media, when you don't talk about Twitter and Elon Musk and, you know, and how things went down, it felt like there was this incredible organic movement, not just like people being paid, like sitting in the Prigozhin-funded bot farm in St. Petersburg, but actually people who self-organize and just spread the message for Ukraine. And it's incredibly great to see.
That's great. I think my favorite meme is the Nord Stream pipeline one, where you've got the little NAFO dog's head popping up out of the gas bubble. But
Steven Seagal. It was so good.
Taras.
I do agree absolutely with Julie, and then it's about humor. Humor might be really a very strong maybe a very strong weapon against it. Because we can't do absolutely the same. We have to do something more creatively, and that will help definitely. And because you have to, we come back again to the personality of a Hopnik. It's, you know, you have to either punch in the nose or just bully him, and then he will understand. So that's one thing, and the other. But where I see a very strong challenge, where I still don't have an answer to. I think one of the social media that is extremely weaponized by Russia is their own, though it's officially not, Telegram, which is extremely widely used worldwide, and especially in Ukraine. And like, I don't know, armed forces have been using it for such a long. All the media people, so everyone is using. And when you ask people, okay, why do you? I don't use Telegram, but when I ask. I'm a very rare person among all my friends, and when I ask them, they say, "Wow, it's so convenient, and that's so easy, you know, to buy." And that's where I think we have to think, what do we do with that? One of the things I think the Ukrainians have already done, that they started using that when all people went to Telegram, they just started using to disseminate the truth. They're even using truths for Russian people, telling them through Telegram channels. But I think we have to do something more with that still.
John, so we've had to catch up, haven't we, and get down with the kids and figure out how this social media stuff works. But you're very adept at this with your daily war diaries on Twitter, and if you're not watching those, I strongly recommend people sign up to that.
Yes, so I had 60,000 followers on Twitter when I arrived, and I started. There was, in particular, the air raid sirens were scary, and I started doing a thing. There's a particular moment when it's snowing. I've got a flat somewhere over Krashatik in the roof. I open the window and I'm very close to the post office, I think, which has got the big air raid siren, and it's blasting away, and it's you know, it's scary. and it's Putin's lullaby. And I just find myself saying, I have a simple message to Vladimir Putin, and it goes like this: Vladimir Putin, do fuck off. And everybody loved it, and it became a thing. At the same time, it's hard to be in Ukraine and not be evangelical about Ukraine, about Ukrainian victory. But also we should deal with some realities here. There are far too many people lying their heads off on social media. Many of them on Twitter is the one I know best, are anonymous. And then, you know, when somebody says something horrible about you, that I'm a paedophile, that I drink too much, that's completely true, so I can't argue about that. But some of this stuff is hideous, and you go, well, who are you? And where are you from? And I don't know that because I don't know their name. So I believe, not both in the context of Ukraine, but also in the context of doing British politics in a civilized and decent way, that everybody who's on social media should stand there under their own name. And if they don't, that's goodbye. That is my policy on this. But I think that Ukraine at the moment, the counteroffensive isn't doing as well as it should be doing, because we in the West have not given the Ukrainians the jets and the long-range rockets and enough tanks and enough ammunition in a timely fashion. So my Ukrainian friends are dying because of our failure in the West to properly supply Ukraine. And in the meantime, people are getting bored. And there's a kind, and that's kind of human, but at the same way, we've got to do better in terms of pushing this message through. Ukraine is fighting for its life still. It's fighting so that its people do not live in fear of being raped or castrated or their children killed. And this isn't academic for us. I mean, I'm sure all of you knew Victoria Amelina. I met her once. She was wonderful. She was a poet. And now she's dead. And she was killed by a rocket sent by the Russians to a pizza restaurant. And then when people in the West go, they talk rubbish that Ukrainians are all Nazis, we don't want to scare Putin, I just think you're wrong. And I'm arguing with somebody who may actually be just another tool of Prigozhin. So this is a problem that we all have, and we've got to say to the West, arm Ukraine properly. And we've got to say to our social media giants, get this Russian Nazi shit off our platforms so we can have a proper and honest conversation with people, but not with bots. And listen, Twitter, Facebook, listen to me. Fix this problem, because if you don't, they're going to come for you too.
What I want to add is that Russia has no rules in this war, and Ukraine still try to keep some rules and be like humanity and all this stuff. But what we start to do is we use psychological method of mirroring and show them, like, when some drones exploded in Moscow Oblast, when is a lot of Ukrainians who tweet, oh my God, how it can be, Russia is bombed themselves, oh my God, how we can help somehow from Ukraine. And I think that this level of irony is very supportive, and people spread it also because it's help for our mental health, and Russians not are very satisfied with all this kind of information, but it's always about our personal responsibility, what we can do. But I think that we need to be more, like, to spread more strategic communication, that our government should do something, and maybe this would be like a mad thing, but we need to have like more Ukrainian propaganda to spread and to give Russia a proper response.
Absolutely. And to close the session out, it's, you know, the Russian propaganda machine is not just bots. It's not just an abstract thing. These are real individuals who are choosing to lie for money, not always being coerced. They're real people, and you can engage with them. After the Skripals were poisoned, I was chased by a dozen people who were pretending to be from Switzerland and all sorts of places. I had a furious argument with them online. In the end, it gets very boring because, and there's no chink of light there. I wasn't going to give in. So I just wrote Spokojna noć, Olga at the end. And he broke cover and wrote Nie boltaj, vrag slušat. So these are real people.
So for stupid people, what does that mean?
That means it's a World War II poster and something from 17 mgновений весны, which is a spy thing, and he was just writing, "Don't gossip, the enemy is listening." So these are real people.
The lady is saying,
Yeah.
Careless talk.
Like careless word. That's it. It's the Russian version of that.
Yes. So clearly, and your guy wasn't.
They're in Olgina. They're in a suburb of St. Petersburg, taking Putin's silver coins for their treachery, lies, and genocide. Thank you to my speakers. This has been a fantastic panel. I'd absolutely like to thank our brilliant guests here, Alina, John, Yulia, and Taras. Thank you.